Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Laurie, and I'm a family support specialist with Raising Special Kids. And we are so thrilled to have Heather Dunphy joining us, who is the lead education program specialist for the Arizona Department of Education. She's here to share some amazing information for our families. And I would love to hand it over to you now, Heather, to share a little bit about you and your role and all the interesting data that you collect for families.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, Laurie. Yeah, what I'd like to talk with you all today is talking about special education data. Now, data can sometimes seem irrelevant to busy parents. So why should a parent be listening to our discussion today? Well, what I'd like to talk about is actual, maybe some questions that a parent can ask at their next IEP meeting or at their next parent teacher meeting so that they can see if their child is on track. What kinds of questions can they ask that seems to get the most bang for the buck so they can see if the services are being implemented and that the school is doing the right thing for their child and just that they feel included. So many parents sometimes feel like, I don't know what to ask. They just kind of let the school make the decision. But really, the parents play such an integral role in their child's success in the school. And so that's what I'd like to do today is to equip parents with some questions that they can ask the school district. And then I'd like to show how are we doing on these particular data points and how does our state track that data and where do we keep it? And I want to let parents know that this data is transparent, that they can see it. And that's what I'd like to share today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Heather. We really appreciate that. And we at Raising Special Kids hear a lot of the same things that we're going to go over today. So we'll get started with our first question. Is my child on track to transition from preschool to kindergarten?
Yeah, so for parents who have children with disabilities in preschool, there is a way where they can kind of find out how their child is doing. There's an assessment that's given to all students in preschool, but what we track as the state for special needs students is their entry score. And this is done within the first few weeks of a student starting the school year. They will be given an entry test, and then there's given an exit test at the end of the year. Parents can have that conversation with the preschool teacher, like, hey, I think I've heard that there's an assessment that's given at the beginning of the year, or hey, this is the end of the year. Let's look at maybe the changes from beginning to the end of the year. What we measure at the state level is the preschool career. So that means when the student entered preschool to the time that they exited preschool. It could be 2 years later, right? And we want to measure that growth that happened from beginning to end. And that's what we measure in the performance report that we send to the federal government that they look at. And so what we see here on this infographic is it says 2024 preschool outcomes. These are the outcomes from the 2023-2024 school year. And we divide them into summary scores. There's a summary score 1, and a summary score 2. What we're interested in at the state level and the federal government is interested in is of the students who started preschool who were below age expectations. So they came in low. Did they make significant progress? That's what we want to know, right? What percent of students are making significant progress? Even if they start really low, all kids can make progress, right? And so there's 3 outcome areas that we measure this progress. The first is in social skills. The second is in knowledge and skills, so like academic, numeracy, literacy, kind of those pre kind of thinking of reading and math later, but what are some of those pre-numeracy and pre-literacy skills? That's what we measure. And then also we measure appropriate behaviors that meet needs, and this has to do with toileting, feeding oneself, dressing oneself, being able to verbalize or ask for what they need in whatever capacity they can. So those are the 3 main areas that we're looking at. And summary score 1 measures what percent of students are making substantial progress, not just a little progress, substantial progress, which means more progress than we thought they would following their trajectory. So we look at that. And in social emotional skills, last year we were at 58%. 58% of students with disabilities made substantial progress upon exiting in social emotional skills. And then for knowledge and skills is 59%, and for use of appropriate behaviors to meet needs, 56% of students are making substantial progress. And we track that over time, and we use that information to have targeted technical assistance for school districts. The other piece is on the right-hand side. It says summary score 2. And what we're looking at here is of the students who came in either at age expectations or below age expectations, how many left preschool ready for kindergarten? They are on track, because that's ultimately what we want to see, right? We want to see kids starting kindergarten ready to go at their appropriate age expected levels, because we know that when students start below, the gap is so hard to bridge that gap as the child gets older in middle school and high school. The gap tends to get wider and wider. So if we can start as early as possible to have kids ready for kindergarten, meet those age expectations, that's the goal. So that's what we measure in summary score 2. And we have 38% of our students are preschool students with disabilities are showing that they're ready for kindergarten in outcome A, which is positive social emotional skills. About 42% have the knowledge and skills ready, that those pre-literacy, pre-numeracy skills, and 46% are showing that they're having those appropriate behaviors to meet needs. So this is a question that a parent of a preschool child with a disability can ask. How are they doing on these entry and exit scores? Are we making progress over the last couple of years? And then if you want to see aggregate information, you can go to our website where we post this information, which is our SPPAPR website, and that will be posted in the description below this video.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I think having the visual along with hearing all the data is so helpful for families. So we appreciate that. The next question that we have here is my child included in the general education environment to the maximum extent possible? I think that's one that we do hear a lot. We want to be able to make sure that we're including kids everywhere we can. So what are you seeing with that?
Yes, thanks, Laurie. The LRE, or least restrictive environment, requires public schools to educate students with disabilities in regular classrooms with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. The least restrictive environment is one that, to the greatest extent possible, satisfactorily educates disabled children together with children who are not disabled in the same school. That the disabled child would attend if the child was not disabled. And there's a little bit of a myth that special education is a place. It's not a place, it's actually a service. So a student has the right to educational services in the general education environment to the maximum extent possible. And some parents think that maybe it's best to have a very restrictive environment because their child will receive more, specialized attention. While that might be true for some students, the first thing that a school district should look at is how can we include this child in the general education classroom? And if that's not possible, even with accommodations and then we look at a more restrictive environment. But first of all, that's a great conversation to have with school districts. Is my child in the environment that's most appropriate, and they're being exposed to general education peers to the maximum extent possible? There's quite a few different educational environments that a child can go into. The ones that we track here as a state are ones that you'll be familiar with probably in your elementary, middle, and high school, and that is LRE A, LRE B, LRE C, and LRE D. These are the main categories that you'll be hearing about. LRE A is when a student with disabilities is included in the general education classroom 80% or more of their day. It could be 100% of their day. They're with gen ed peers. It could be 80%, but it's between 80% and 100% of the day. And what we're seeing as a state is 69% of our students with disabilities, K through 12, are in that type of setting. They're with their general education peers most of the day, 69%. LREB is what you might hear called a resource setting, and that is when the student will be in their general education classroom for part of the day, and then they might go see a specialized teacher for a couple of hours a day. So between 40% and 79%, they're with their gen ed peers. As a state, we have 13% of our students with disabilities are in that type of environment. The next category that we can talk about is LREC, and that's for students who are spending less than 40% of the day. Parents might hear this word as a self-contained room, and that is when students are sometimes, on the campus, but they're in a separate environment for most of their day, working with a specialized teacher to receive their instruction and services. And in Arizona, we're at 13% of our students are in that type of setting. And then LRED is for students who are in separate schools, residential facilities, or home-based hospital placements. We have 3% of our students in that type of setting. And then I have also posted the national averages below in the infographic, and you can see that we're right on par with the national averages
That's
for
amazing.
for K through 12.
So now I know you said K through 12,
Mm-hmm.
but does that also ring true for preschool? Because I know that different ages, parents
Mm-hmm.
have different questions.
Yeah, so an IEP is required to serve a student with a free and appropriate education, that's FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, regardless of age, and that includes preschool children. So this next infographic shows our breakdown of how we're doing as a state with our preschool environments. Instead of LREA, LREB, LREC, LRED, it's coded a little bit differently. We call an inclusive environment a regular early childhood program. And so in Arizona, we have 40% of our students of our preschool students are in regular early childhood environment. Those are in an inclusive setting, which means that at least half of the students in the classroom are non-disabled. And we've made great strides. It was 27% about 5 years ago, and now we're at 40%. So we're seeing more and more preschool students are being included with their general education peers. And then we have kind of the inverse. We don't have as many educational environments in preschool, so 51% are in separate specialized class or a separate school or a residential facility. And then we have a very small percentage, less than 1%, is in receiving services in their home.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all of that information again. Another important question. I know that parents are such an integral part of this process because that's how we get the data and how you guys are able to interpret all of this. Can you share with families how they can expect to get the information for the survey when it comes out and how it's delivered to them?
Yes, the survey is open between January and May each year. The parent should receive a code from their school district in some manner, maybe texting or email, or it might be at a meeting. And the purpose of this survey that we're asking parents to fill out is that we know that their involvement impacts a child's social, emotional, physical health, their school readiness, and their success in school, and even after school. The parents have such a huge impact. And so when the parents respond to these survey questions, it can help the educators see new ways to build safe, welcoming, trusting environments. This is how we hear from the parents, and that's how the federal government can see, okay, overall, how our state's doing with making parents feel included in the IEP process. All school districts and charters are required to give the survey. And some parents may be hesitant to fill out the survey because they feel that their responses are not anonymous. And I want to let you know that I've seen the data come in, and the districts in charge do not see the parents' names or demographic data. They only see the responses to the questions. The reason that we even ask for the demographic data, like a specific code, the specific code is matched to your child's race, ethnicity data, and age of the child, and disability status. And the reason that we link that with the code is to ensure that the surveys are representative. Because as an analyst, when we're looking at the data and we can see that, the majority of the responses are from a certain demographic area, then we can't really say that that is representative of how everybody feels in the state. So how would we know unless we get that demographic information? But don't let that be a barrier to filling out the survey. The only way that a school district would know that it's particularly you who filled it out is in the comment section. You said your name or specifically your situation with your child's name or gave personally identifying information or something like that. That's the only way. So just wanted to let you know that. So we appreciate all of the responses. That being said, let's go ahead and take a look at an infographic of the 2024 Parent Involvement Survey. This infographic shows that we've got 8 questions. There are 9 questions. The 9th question is an open-ended question that parents can fill in more information about their involvement. But 1 through 8 these are the questions that are asked in the survey. The one that's highlighted in green is the one that we use when we do our state reporting. And that question is, overall, I'm satisfied with how my child's school makes it easy for me to be involved. So we're really looking at parent involvement. And as a state, when we look at the answer to that question, we're at 93%. So 93% of the parents who are filling out the survey are saying, yes, we feel like we are included. However, we have to look at how many parents are actually filling out the survey. And we see that information by looking down at the information at the bottom of the chart, where we are receiving responses from 14% of our population. And now 14% can still be, representative, and it is. But the more responses that we get, the more of a better picture that we see as a whole state of how we're doing.
That is wonderful information. And we encourage people here at Raising Special Kids as well to fill out those surveys and give your feedback because your voice does make a difference. So thank you for that as well. Another question that we do hear a lot, especially towards the end of the school year, is about testing and accommodations and modifications, what's allowed, what's not allowed. So many questions surrounding that. So I'll let you kind of talk about that if you don't mind for a couple minutes.
Of course, this is a great question because we know that all students are required to take these tests, and we want to make sure we equip students with disabilities with, as much as we can to prepare them for success. But before we discuss the accommodations or modifications on the assessment, I just want to take a moment to express the purpose of the assessment. And the purpose of the state standardized test is to have a standard to measure by. And what makes them standardized is that they're conducted in a very standardized way. The environment is standardized, which means the test is given under nearly identical conditions. Like the teacher's rooms need to be arranged in a certain way. The walls are covered up with any information that could help students on the test. The desks are arranged in a certain way. The person administering the test has to read a script upon administering the test. And the test assesses students based on similar sets of questions. And so what we're trying to do is to make things as identical as possible so that we can see what do kids really know. Then the tests are graded by machines or even a reviewer who doesn't know the students. And so using this approach sets a clear benchmark for comparing student performance across different districts. It holds teachers accountable, and it supports educators when they see the results in crafting their curriculum. And I'd like to think of standardized assessments almost like an annual checkup, right? You get it's an opportunity to find out how the students are doing. How is your child doing? The test has 3 or more categories that describe different contents or like parts of the test. So it's not just one score and that's all that you get. It's usually broken into multiple subsections. So you can actually see, oh, you did well in this area, maybe not as well in this area and this. And then let's look at last year and see, did you make progress in this area over last year? So you can use multiple years to see if your child's progressing in certain like content areas. And so you can track progress over time. And I would like to say that Indicator 17 is one of our state performance plan indicators, and we look at state assessment scores. And for Indicator 17, we have a specialist here who works just on that indicator and looks at 3rd grade students reading assessments. And if a school district does not meet that proficiency level, then his team will work with that school district. So these scores are important to receive so that if we can see over the whole state who needs the most targeted assistance. And that information is also on that SPPAPR page to dive in a little bit deeper into Indicator 17. There's so much to talk about with testing.
There is.
There is so much. So I would like to say that students do not need to pass a test to move on to a grade, and that does include the ACT in high school, is what students are taking currently. They don't need to pass that test in order to advance a grade or in order to graduate. So now back to the accommodations and modifications. So there's two sections that list accommodations on an IEP. One section is for everyday accommodations and modifications, and those are for the learning environment. And those are allowed in the classroom all of the time. And then there's a second section that's only for standardized tests. It's usually on like the next page of an IEP. And so there's two separate sections, and you're going to see that they're not exactly the same. There might be some overlap, but it might not be exactly the same. The second section only is for standardized tests. They have their own sets of rules. Sometimes the test manufacturer has their own rules that this and this is not allowed. And some things are allowed. And if it is, they just embed that for universal use. So all kids would have access to a drop-down calculator because all these tests now are on the computer. And so things can pop up and help students, and it helps all students. So they have their own allowable accommodations. Now, when it comes to modifications, modifying is that the test is actually changing, right? And that can be fine for like a learning environment kind of thing. But when it comes to testing, again, we're trying to standardize things. And so when you talk about standardized tests, there aren't modifications. We're not shortening the test or rephrasing the questions in any way. So we're not going to be looking at modifications when it comes to standardized tests, but the accommodations can be added, which allows children to take the same test as their peers, but it changes how they take the test. So common accommodations would include like the way that the information is presented. It can allow students to access information such as enlarged print or read aloud instructions for the math sections. It wouldn't work for the reading, the reading sections, but for math, those questions can be read to them if that's appropriate. You can have response accommodations. This allows students to complete assessments using some type of a device or an organizer. This is where maybe a calculator, a graphic organizer, graph paper, a dry erase board, a slant board. Now, calculators can be used on an IEP as a regular classroom tool to assist in the learning environment, but might not be allowed on the assessment because what we're trying to do is we're trying to see what does your student know, will your child know compared to all others that are his or her age. So we're trying to standardize that test. I mean, let's be honest, a calculator is going to help all kids, right? And
Right.
so, yes, but a note about the calculators. So they're not allowed for math in grades 3 through 6. They are allowed in 7th grade math on portions for all students. And also in the 8th grade, they are allowed. And then in high school, there's sections that allow the calculators, but the school provides the calculators. It needs to be a certain calculator, and all students are given an opportunity to learn how to use the calculator and use it. And then also 5th grade science has an embedded calculator in the test. So that's the AZ-SCI. And so, but it's for all students. And then there's also setting accommodations where the student might change the location on where they're taking the test, so they can test in a smaller group setting with a familiar test administrator that could help ease the anxiety if they're with a teacher that they're familiar with. But sometimes on test days, students are assigned in different classrooms with maybe a teacher who's proctoring that they're not familiar with. So that is something that can be requested. And then finally, I'll talk about timing. Increase the allowable length of a time to complete an assessment, such as extended time or frequent breaks. I will say, though, that these kind of accommodations should only be put if necessary, if they actually help the child. If you're saying, oh, extended time, of course that's going to help. Well, it could backfire. If a child knows they have extended time, they might just waste it. They might sleep. I've seen this. And so if you really have to know your child, would my child benefit from extended time because they need that really, they're really processing, or would they just end up just stretching out the day? And so that's just important to consider, that these accommodations really are helpful, and to review those every year because children change. And so make sure that these accommodations are appropriate for your child.
That is such wonderful information. I know that helps a ton of our parents who ask these questions all the time. So Always appreciate that and the advice that comes with it. It's good to think about both sides of that. The next question is definitely a topic that we get calls on all the time, and it's about transition. So I'm going to read this one to you. Does my child's transition plan include transition services, including the courses of study that support post-secondary goals? So what happens after high school?
Yes, this is great. We've talked about the preschool parent, we've talked about the parent who has, kids taking tests and their LRE, and now we're getting into high school. So if you're a parent of a high school student, let's talk about what a transition plan is. So we know what an IEP is because you've probably seen that, but now we have another plan. This is a plan for just for high school students. And the purpose of the transition plan is to help students prepare for life after high school. It outlines transition goals and services based on the student's needs and strengths and skills and interests. Now, the plan needs to include some basic components, and this is what you can ask as a parent. You can make sure, are these components in there? There are 8 critical, important pieces that we track as a state. Our monitoring specialists go and do reviews of files to make sure these 8 components are in the transition plan. Then these 8 things include things like the use of an appropriate transition assessment. And this is an assessment that would be given to your child to identify their interests, their preferences, their strengths and needs that could prepare them for life after high school. And then goals. There needs to be goals in there that are measurable. The goals need to be updated annually, and there must be transition services and coursework that would enable the child to meet those goals. So those are some of those important components that you can ask about and make sure that they are included in the transition plan.
Well, and I know that there have been some changes in Arizona lately with that transition plan. Could you just share a little bit about that with us and what parents should know about that?
Yes, yes. The IDEA requires transition planning to be included not later than the first IEP in place when a student turns 16. So that's the federal mandate. However, last October, Arizona chose to start this process even earlier, and that is by completion of the freshman year or age 16, whichever comes first. Early transition planning in high school really is best practice for students with disabilities to get as early as possible to improve those post-secondary outcomes.
Thank you for that. It's always helpful to hear those updates when they come out. The last question I have for you is that we hear often as well is my child on track to graduate with a high school diploma in 4 years, like their peers?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's been a couple other updates. 2 other additions to the IEP that need to be included now are that the student's estimated graduation date needs to be included in the IEP, aligned with the transition plan. And the school must provide written notification to parents of a student's anticipated graduation date at least 1 year before that anticipated school graduation date. And then the IEP team may determine the sequence and courses and classes which the student may take. So we want the parent to be very involved with that. What kind of coursework is my child taking? Is that appropriate? Is that going to help him or her based on their strengths and areas of need? And then, as mentioned earlier, the child does not need to pass the state test or the ACT in order to graduate. There is another test that you'll hear about high school students taking, and that's called the civics test. The student's IEP team can decide whether to make that civics test a requirement for graduation for that student. So that's something that you can bring up in a meeting too, is the civics test required for my child to graduate or not? The IEP team may not alter the number of credits, so a parent can't say, oh, can we just do like 15 credits instead of 22? It has to be, we have to meet the certain criteria for a student to graduate, but you can ask about how many credits have we done so far, how many more do we have to go, and this can all be incorporated in your IEP meetings or your parent-child meetings. And so I'd like to end with one more infographic about our high school exit data. And on the left-hand side, we see a percentage on a pie chart of our students who have graduated or dropped out or reached maximum age. That's how we measure at the Department of Education and at the federal level our exit data. so we're not necessarily measuring a freshman who starts and we see what happens 4 years later to that student to see if they graduated or not. The way that we measure it here for our SPPAPR is how many students who have a disability who are between ages 14 and 21 leave high school, period. That's what we're measuring. And now we try to figure, okay, why did they leave? Now, if they left and transitioned to another school, they're not considered a dropout, of course. But if we don't hear from them and they just left, they're considered a dropout, even if they're 14 or 15. And so here what we're seeing is 76% of students in the 22-23 school year, 76% of the students who left were because they graduated. And that is looking at students who dropped out or graduated or reached maximum age. 24% dropped out. So that means we just are not sure where the follow-up is. Maybe they did get homeschooled. Maybe they are in some other environment getting some learning, but it's not recorded. It's not reported to the department. And then less than 1% reached maximum age. So they're 22 years old and they aged out. And that's the reason that they exited high school. So what we look at then is, well, what happened 1 year later? Because that's really important too. All of this work that we've done in preschool and elementary and middle and high school with the supports and the parent survey and all of this kind of comes to an end with our last measurement, and that is our post-school outcomes survey. 1 year after a child exits high school, they're given an opportunity to respond to a survey. Usually that's done on a phone call from the school district or from maybe someone from the school is contacting your child or you to get answers to some questions about some follow-up. How are things going? And what we're trying to see is how many students are in what we call an engagement category. They're engaged in something involved in the community. They're not engaged. Okay, that would be the opposite. So when we look at categories of engagement, you can see on this infographic, these are the 4 categories: competitive employment, higher education, other post-secondary education, and other employment. And so you can read more about these 4 categories on the post-school outcomes website. But this is just a quick infographic to show that of the students who 1 year later were engaged, these are the categories of engagement. 36% go into competitive employment, and there's certain rules to meet to be competitively employed. And then higher education, 20% of students with disabilities are in higher education. And then other post-secondary education, so they're in some sort of training, but it doesn't quite meet that criteria of higher education. There's 10%. And then other employment wouldn't quite meet the criteria of competitive employment, but they're still employed. And so that's 7%. So that kind of gives you an idea of what's happening to our students 1 year after high school. And for students who are not engaged, then that's data that we analyze as a state too, in order to reach out to those school districts to provide some targeted assistance on how they can increase the engagement rate among students who have dropped out and things of that nature.
That's absolutely amazing. And we are so thankful for all that you do and all the hard work you put into all this, helping our children and our families out there. And I just want to say thank you for your time and being here to explain this to families. Please keep an eye out for your parent involvement survey. Take the time and fill that out. It really does help to give them valuable information that they can use to help service students all over Arizona.
Well, thank you for having me, Laurie.
Absolutely. Thank you.